Good afternoon. Welcome all to the 18th Jeremy Grantham lecture on climate change. I welcome all of you and all those attending through online mode. And this event is also live telecast in YouTube channel. With pleasure, I welcome today's speaker, Professor Michael Greb from University College London. Welcome, warm welcome. He's delivering the lecture titled Planetary Economics and the Challenges of Climate Change. I would introduce him briefly before inviting him to deliver the lecture. Michael Greb is a professor of energy and climate change at University College London. He was leading the energy and environmental program at Chatham House in the 90s. His career has combined a wide range of energy systems and climate change research with half-time implementation roles. Prior to University College London, he held positions at the Imperial College London and Cambridge University, conducting research alongside roles at the UK Carbon Trust as chief economist and subsequently chairing the UK government's independent panel of technical experts on electricity market reform. Professor Greb was one of the original members of the UK Climate Change Committee established under the UK Climate Change Act to advise the government on future carbon budgets and to report to Parliament on their implementation. In 2018, Professor Greb was appointed as the convening lead author for Chapter 1 of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, Mitigation. Following completion of the report in 2022, he became Strategy Director for a major international research program on the economics of energy innovation and system transition. Professor Greb is author of 8 books, over 60 journal research articles, and numerous other publications, making seminal contributions in areas of international climate policy, carbon pricing, and the economics of innovation. His book, Planetary Economics, brings together lessons from 25 years of research and implementation of energy and climate policies. And in 2021, won the Marcel Boitou Prize for Outstanding Book Contributing to Energy Economics and its Literature by the International Association for Energy Economics. With this introduction, I request Professor Greb to deliver the 18th Grantham lecture. Please.
So, Professor Sashith, Ashwin, and Divya Center here, thank you very much for the invitation to address you. I realize the title of this talk might look a little bit ambitious, as was the title of the book that I will be drawing upon in some of this talk. But then publishers like ambitious titles to get attention. I hope in the course of this talk, I'll be able to explain a bit what I mean by that term and the foundations on which the concept of planetary economics and some of the more micro implications for policy are. So what I will do is I will say a little bit about the scientific framing of climate change risks. I'll be pretty brief in that, not least because I suspect that many of you in this audience and those listening online may by now know more about climate science than I do. So I apologize if I'm saying things you know well. But I will obviously focus then on the economic dimensions, debates around how we think about the global economics of climate change, then of mitigation, where I will argue that there's a fundamental change underway about how we think about the economics of abatement and mitigation. And that will then be illustrated with respect to the book overall. And in case you're pretty depressed about the situation on climate change, I will finish with one of several indications of some hope as well. Now, most of you in this room will know the basics of climate change. What I want to do in the science area is to actually say a bit more about how we have tried to frame the issue in relation to communicating what climate change might imply. And the first thing we come across, of course, is uncertainty. The Earth system is very complex. Exactly how will it respond to all the forces that we're placing on it? So the way that this has been approached in the IPCC has for 20 years been based loosely around what they call the reasons for concern, different kinds of reasons we'd be worried. And it's outlined 5 of those reasons. One is the risk that it poses to unique and threatened systems, like ecosystems, maybe on mountaintops that have nowhere to migrate to, particular small island or coral areas. The second is extreme weather events. The third is the overall distribution of impact, in the sense that clearly some countries, some regions will be impacted much more and earlier than others. Then reason for number 4 was when climate change reaches a scale where it has global implications. And then 5th, and somewhat distinct, is the concern about large-scale singular events, scientific tipping points at a global or major regional scale, like collapse of particular major weather or ecosystems. So that has been a framework, and this became known as the burning embers diagram. You can probably see why from the coloring if you ever watch a fire. And in the 1.5 degree report of the IPCC, they gave a bit more detail on underlying what was in the scientist's mind in this color coding. But you'll note it's an index almost free of numbers. They're not trying to say, well, there's a 37% risk of this, because the communication of risk when there's such uncertainty is itself a bit of an art. Where that has then gone in terms of the science is roughly as follows. First, if I move on to the most recent IPCC report, it outlined 5 scenarios, SSPs, with emission trends as flagged on the left here. And on the right is an indication of the cumulative carbon under each of those scenarios. Each of them just on that diagram going out to 2050. The reason quite simple, and again, I would think many of you may know it, which is to an embarrassingly high precision, the degree of temperature change in the long run is driven by the cumulative amount of carbon. And I say embarrassing because for 10 or 15 years, we had fantastically complicated models about how different scenarios led to different degrees of warming. And eventually someone pointed out, actually, if you just add up the total cumulative carbon emissions, you will get very close to the committed temperature change. And so the diagram on the right is an indication of the total cumulative CO2 emitted since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see even in the next 4 decades, we are potentially adding a lot more compared with the historical total, which is driving up the temperatures. Where that then leads is a picture like this, where we see the full span of those emission scenarios in terms of temperature on the left, and how they then play across to those 5 reasons of concern on the right. And as an energy scientist, let me make a slightly controversial comment on this, which is, I don't believe that top scenario is plausible anymore. It is not going to happen. And this has been an ongoing debate, but I think we've seen enough progress that one thing we have achieved already is to rule out the very highest emission scenarios. And that's great, except that if you look on the right-hand side, that would have been catastrophic on all dimensions. And at the same time that we've begun to maybe narrow the range of future emissions, the science has appeared to be consistently looking worse, so that we see more severe impacts starting to unfold at lower temperature changes than perhaps are projected in some of the previous reports. So, it's a bit of a mixed message there. And the point is that even the difference between 1.5 and 2 looks significant. Above 2, we appear to be entering, ever more risky terrains, as you can see from the move from the yellow to red to darker purples there. This poses a challenge of analysis, complexity, and communication. So I scratched my head about what I could usefully say about impacts, and I concluded an audience like this doesn't need more pictures of extreme storms and flooded towns or desertification. You all know that kind of thing can happen under climate change. You all know there's growing evidence. So I've chosen a very boring slide out of the second report of this year, of the 6th assessment of IPCC, which really just underlines the extent to which impacts will vary by region, and they will vary across at least a dozen different indicators that we need to worry about. And what is in this chart, if you look closely, the different shades are degrees of confidence, but there are very few pluses. There are some, but they're hugely outweighed by the expected negative impacts of climate change, the minus in all those circles. And almost all aspects of health and well-being in almost all regions are expected to be negatively impacted by climate change. But as I say, it's hard to boil that down to a single message for a decision maker. It's complex. And I think part of the communication challenge will be to communicate to national decision makers what climate change might imply for them, as well as for the wider world and their interrelationships in many ways. Final remark about the science and impacts, because that's not my main area, is just a reminder that beyond the things we see immediately on the land and human habitation, the oceans are, of course, very important. Various things going on in the ocean, very clearly tracked decline of sea ice, change in acidity, which we can easily forget about, of somewhat unknown consequence as the acidity increases. And some of the impacts will accumulate for a very long time. The classic issue is sea level rise. And under most assessments, still modest this century. Depends a little bit where you live, whether you think it's modest, but less than a meter. But of course, the big ice sheets, particularly of the polar regions, melt slowly, but over centuries. And on the far right are projections out to 2300 sea level rise. And much of that would be committed. We could stop at 2 degrees, the sea level just goes on rising. So let me now start turning towards the core of this, because what does economics have to say about this? Well, the economic approach instinctively is to try and get an integrated view on this that aims to balance the costs of abatement or emissions mitigation, and I'll use those two words interchangeably, with the benefits. What are we trying to buy? What are we trying to avoid by efforts to cut emissions? And how do we add them up? Well, the conceptual theory looks something like this, which is, at least it used to be, estimate the cost of specific impacts or the cost of adaptation to climate change. What might it do to food prices, how you actually spend on defense, coastal defenses, etc. You translate that to some kind of welfare measure, in economics known as a utility function, and then you aggregate that over all the world. You might add some sort of equity weighting, because poor regions can pay less, if you like, to avoid some of these. And you need to aggregate over time, over the future. And economics is very familiar. It has a very standard technique called time discounting. And let's face it, if anyone in this room, I offered you $100 today or in 10 years' time, which would you rather have? If you've got any sense, you probably want it today. for various reasons. You can invest, that can grow, you may be richer in the future's more uncertain. So economists tend to add up over time by knocking off a certain percentage every year into the future. And it's a combination of some ethical value about how much we care about the future and how much richer we expect to be because of wealth growth. Well, that's actually sounds perfectly logical, but of course, exponential growth or compound is a powerful thing. And on the right, I've just shown what it does to how we weight in a present calculation future impacts. And the answer is, even at what economists would see as a very low level, between 3 and 5%, it means that within a few decades, almost anything gets discounted to irrelevance because it's just seen to be too far away to matter in terms of present money. There's been a long-running debate in economics about this, including in relation to climate change. It goes back at least till 1992. And I'm going to run you briefly through a little bit more of debates around this notion of how to cost climate damages. I'll do it in 3 acts. The first act, following those early forays, was actually the IPCC second assessment when the US Clinton administration persuaded the IPCC to organize its third working group around cross-cutting social and economic issues. And that partly was intended to deliver a cost-benefit assessment because that's what the US Congress legally requires to pass legislation. And we had the very, very first generation of integrated assessment models. And one thing they had to do was add up potential deaths around the world and attach some number to it. And economists do this in countries, they call it the value of statistical life. How much would a government spend to reduce the risk of death in its population? Now, this is an old debate. Apologies for those of you that know it. But at that point, India, obviously a much poorer country, could spend far less on healthcare. Its value of statistical life was a lot lower than the United States. In fact, a factor of 50. And the economists just added this up. And, pardon the phrase, all hell broke loose when they tried to take this to the IPCC. It was the Indian Environment Minister, Kamal Nath, who said this is absurd, discriminatory, and utterly unacceptable. And to my knowledge, it's the only time in the history of the IPCC when the governments disavowed the chapter and the chapter authors dissociated themselves from the policymaker summary, because the policymaker summary said, obviously, this is outrageous and unethical and should not be considered. And I was interested, there was a very recent, concise summary of this debate, which basically said, yeah, there is no very logical answer to this question of how you add up lives over the planet when you're dealing with a global threat, because it wasn't never going to expected that India would pay for reducing its own health, but there's an ethical question about how money passes between different countries of different emission levels, historical contributions, wealth, etc. But in the standard economic toolbox, there's a tendency just to reach for global GDP as if that is a reasonable measure of the damage. One of the most widely used models was by Bill Nordhaus, and it predicted an optimal level of global change of about 4 degrees. On the right-hand side, incidentally, you'll see this rather curious feature that what that basically meant was the world is expected to just get much, 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 much richer, whether or not there was climate change, whether or not you cut emissions. That's basically what it was saying. The issue is just dominated by other things, and tackling climate change and its impact are fairly modest compared with everything else that was projected in that model. Well, a lot of people were uncomfortable with that. And again, Act 2 was 10 years later when the UK hosted the G7 summit. Our Prime Minister, Tony Blair, focused it on 2 main agendas, Africa and climate change, and actually afterwards reflected that on Africa, the response may have been inadequate, but at least you could reach a deal because everyone knew what they were talking about. On climate change, there seemed to be this absolutely fundamental division between different parts of the world and different analytic communities as to how serious was this problem. There was then a review, very famous at its time, led by Lord Nicholas Stern, who basically said that the conventional economic way of doing this is wrong for multiple reasons. And the one I'll just flag most is he said, there's a lot of deep uncertainty. And that doesn't mean you ignore the issue, it's quite the opposite. It means horrible things could happen. And just because you're not sure how likely they are doesn't mean you can ignore them. And that plus some other things, including an ethical approach to the very low discount rate for future impacts, basically led him to say, no, the economic shifts to the risks are of inadequate action and the need for an international arrangement. A quick sketch of a way of thinking about the sheer scale of uncertainties and imponderables in this is, I rather like this, I call it the risk matrix. And it just breaks the issues down into three categories of science, one of which is the average predicted trend, which is reasonably easy, plus or minus a bit. The climate variability, what will happen to the extremes of storms or droughts or whatever. And then these large-scale singularities, a fundamental shift in some Earth systems. And across the top, as an economist, one should think about what are impacts on markets, which I know roughly how to cost, because they'll affect relative prices and investment costs. Non-market, things I should value, but there's no money attached to it. So I'm kind of making some other proxy that I'll try and add in dollar terms. And then what actually, if stresses become so bad that social systems start to collapse, of how we organize, basically social stability. What is the cost of a collapse of a society because of the stresses of climate change? And of course, in the bottom right, it's unfortunately not that hard to envisage regional collapses, famine, and wars. I'll say a few more words about it. So Act 3 then was following this debate. More serious heavyweight economists came into the field. Marty Weitzman was one. And he basically produced what he called his dismal theorem, which is the most important things are the things we cannot measure. We cannot pretend we can ever know enough about the extremes of risk on climate change in time to do anything about it. Because by the time we see the empirical evidence, it's too late to stop it. So he basically said economics shouldn't pretend it can come up with a rational answer to this. And others, Partha Dasgupta, came in around complex arguments that basically said, well, if we care that much about poor people in the future, then we should actually spend much more money on helping poor people today. So we should just do more international aid instead of tackling climate change. And Partha basically said, well, that may sound that makes economic sense on paper, but that is simply not how the world operates. So we've got this debate on the social cost of carbon emissions that became increasingly esoteric. No deep resolution, not much consensus. The Paris Agreement reasserted actually the fundamental principle of the UNFCCC, which had said the aim should be to avoid dangerous interference. And it took a negotiated outcome as to what does that mean, informed by scientific risks. You could argue with how do we resolve really difficult imponderables in our society? And the answer is usually by negotiation and elections. And you can kind of see Paris is sort of doing that with the deep imponderables about the fact that climate change matters differently to different people, different places, different perceptions. And of course, the small island state said it's got to be 1.5 degrees. Otherwise, we may cease to exist. And the scientific community was pretty unified in saying it's got to be somewhere below 2 degrees. And so we ended up with that range as the goal for the Paris Agreement. A final rider on this, there was some really good theoretical discussion of these challenges in the 5th assessment of IPCC, but the 6th assessment published earlier this year is the first time since 1995 the IPCC dared to say anything about global cost benefit. And what it actually said was quite interesting. It said, well, actually, there are very different ways of trying to measure economically the damages of climate change. We all know how the original ideas worked, but more recently, there's been a literature of statistical, empirical methods looking at actually countries that have suffered from climate change damages. And those are the ones that produce the estimates on the right in the sort of the green circles, to some extent the yellow circles. An order of magnitude higher than the previous approaches, which were just how much will it cost to build sea defences, etc., or to adapt farming. And it's partly also because you can't actually predict. It's all very well to say, well, the cost of adapting farming is this much, but in reality, farmers won't adapt until they've been hit. So it's like the idea, yes, we won't have dumb farmers who never change anything in the climate changes, but nor can we have clairvoyant farmers who know exactly when is the next extreme going to hit. So that, I think, has, if you find this kind of thing important, that has been a very important development in the literature. Okay, so that was, if you like, how hard it's been to grapple with anything that economists would normally seek around, if you like, the damage side of planetary economics. Most of my own research is focused much more on mitigation, and I now want to turn to developments in that field. And again, I'll start from the classic economic framing, which was to set against the damages, we need an estimate of the cost of abatement, cost of emissions mitigation. Here on the left, I've drawn what was called the marginal abatement cost curves from the DICE model, from Professor Nordhaus's model. In case you wonder why I reference to him, it kind of, hard to avoid a Nobel Prize winner in economics for this kind of work, even if many of us have serious doubts about the way it was done. But that was what Bill Nordhaus built into his model. It assumed they vary. If you actually look at the range of cutting emissions globally by 10, 20% or so, quite a substantial variation in the costs. To some extent, that reflected nothing to do with abatement technologies. It was just the cost of fossil fuels, because that's low carbon relative to fossil fuels. There was a completely different kind of abatement cost curve also produced by engineers, in this case, McKinsey consultants, drawing on engineers who stacked up what are every single option we can think of to cut emissions. And let's order them. So we start with the cheapest on the left and stack them all to get the most expensive on the right. And what they said was, well, the cheapest ones are actually deeply negative. In other words, we save a lot of money if, for example, we have better insulated buildings or more efficient lighting. It will save emissions and it will save money. The economist reaction tended to be, well, that can't really be true, because if it saved money, people would do it, wouldn't they? And of course, that's not at all as simple. But, very different pictures of how much it would actually cost to cut emissions. So what I then want to add into this is an observation, not about those numbers or those shapes, but about how the whole thing was framed. And what I mean by that is the following. The basic assumption has been, co-host asked me to share my video. Well, I'm happy to share my video. I hope the video is shared. Depending on how I look, that may or may not be a good thing. But the basic assumption is there is some default path out there which involves ever more emissions, and we incur some cost by forcing our economies to have lower emissions. Okay, that's actually been a very standard assumption. But if we actually think about it, what it means is technically there is a cost at every time t in the future that is some function of the degree of abatement, mu, where mu is defined as the distance from the default high emissions path. And DICE uses a fairly standard formulation of saying the cost rises at some power function of the degree of abatement. Fine. And for years and years, people just thought, yeah, fine, that's obvious. But if you think about it for a moment, it's something really odd, because there's no history in that equation at all. How much it costs to cut emissions by 90% in 2070 is unrelated to anything we've done before in this model. I think most of us know that doesn't make sense, right? We're talking about big infrastructure. We're talking about transport infrastructure, the design of cities, power stations, and the evolution of technology. So a fundamental challenge in this kind of conception is most of the models have had an underlying assumption of temporal independence, at least the stylized models. Of course, it's more complicated now. Many models do have some capital stuff, but basically, you're cutting emissions related to technology at an assumed cost at an assumed point in time in the future. When in reality, there are at least 3 different components of dynamic realism. There is inertia in the system. It takes time to change. There is induced innovation. Your actions will change technologies, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And also, I'm giving a lecture straight afterwards, which I will focus on innovation issues. And economic systems are path dependent. Just look around you, just look across countries. Of course, what we have today and tomorrow depends upon what we've done in the past. Now, we're not going to run you through a whole new model. That's not the sort of the nature of this lecture. But I just wanted to flag that we've published a highly stylized way of at least thinking about these kinds of issues. So you end up with an equation which only has one other term related to it, which is to say some costs are associated with the rate of change. Simple as that. We formulate it, though, in terms of thing pliability, which says how pliable are our economic systems? To what extent can we simply steer them in a different direction? It will take effort. It will therefore take transitional expenditure. We may need to build more high-speed train lines, for example. But once we've done them, or once we've insulated a house, I don't know about you, I had my house insulated 15 years ago. It was quite a hassle. Energy prices go down to 0. I'm not going to take the insulation out again. You know, these things are irreversible. So, but it was a transitional investment. And you can characterize the time scale for changing an energy system. So I won't go into depth, but there's obviously a trade-off that a lot of the things people assumed were costly actually may turn out not to be costly once you've done the upfront effort. So we compare the standard model on the left, completely non-pliable. The abatement cost is assumed rigid. And on the right hand, a fully pliable system, where actually once you've made an effort, you're just on a new trajectory and there's no pressure to go back to the high carbon. And what you discover is a very different kind of pattern emerges. So on the left, the red is a sort of default global emissions. The blue is the Nordhaus standard assumption of what happens to global emissions. They carry on rising for a while and then they go down and hit 0 sometime in the next century. And then the line at the bottom is if the system is fully pliable. What is going on there is if you can change the direction of the energy system, you will make a lot more effort earlier on because it buys you a whole long stream of future benefits of lower emissions. So the marginal benefit is not the benefit of reducing a ton of emissions today. It is the benefit of a whole stream of future emission reductions following from the actions you have taken. And that fundamentally changes the cost-benefit equation as to how much effort might one want to take now. In fact, to a degree that is just as big as many of those esoteric debates about the social cost. And the outcome is, even on some of the weakest assumptions about the damage of climate change, you still stay below 2 degrees under that kind of economic framing. So I just think that's a really interesting insight because so many of the models have just not paid attention to that kind of. So the conclusions of this part is that the traditional framing implied sharply rising costs of both climate damages and of abatement costs. Both you just had to work harder and harder and harder throughout the century to cope with climate impact and with deeper emission reductions. In reality, overwhelming evidence that we do have a lot of capacity to innovate and change the direction of energy systems, but that it can take decades to achieve that. So, broadly, I put the somewhat provocative title on this paper of modelling myths because it seemed to me a lot of the standard modelling was. It was all the economics debate was around how bad is climate damage. And just said, well, but how reasonably good could be the mitigation effort if you take account of some of these other things. and that combination can lead to optimal, in economic terms, levels of effort, similar to some of what we get in more extreme or high costly climate damage assumptions. So I'll now move on to the fourth main section. I've only got one slide on the last bit. Not because there's only one bit of hope, but there are some others I'll hopefully catch up later. Planetary economics. Now, one thing is, that may have sounded good, but we have actually made rather little global progress on mitigation. And it's worth thinking about why, because I expect many of you have been amongst those warning about risks of climate change for a long time. Well, it's complicated, and human beings are complicated. We need to think about the complexity of human psychology, of multi-objective and multi-level decision-making. Governments are dealing with all kinds of different challenges. They have conflicting priorities. You have a very, many layers of hierarchy in decision-making, and all of that complicates things. And when I look at the global optimal scenarios, whether from economists or from Working Group 1, I think, and these deep mitigation, I think, yeah, so you've got a really ambitious abatement scenario here. So tell me, who is going to implement it? What global decision maker is there? I would love to meet them. There is no global decision maker, and we need to develop our understanding of the challenge to the complexity of human societal decision. But a default, as viewed from an economist at least, is you want to try and do this trade-off business. You weigh up the costs and benefits, you evaluate the cost of carbon, that's something like it, you put a price on emissions, and that perhaps is an arena, at least where, as I've said, we're adding much more solid evidence around social cost of carbon. But there's actually, and I think still for quite a few people, a very different level of what you might call myopic, which is people who are indifferent. They're not scientists, or they're skeptical, or they're just disengaged, or they're disempowered. And I think increasingly, I would imagine growing here as well, certainly in Europe, the majority of young people are really worried about climate change, but many still feel, well, what can I do? So if I can't actually do anything about it, or think it's maybe not proven, or maybe it won't hurt me, psychologically, there's a phrase, ignorance is bliss. Or you just say, well, it's somebody else's problem. And that, frankly, is largely where we have been for the last 3 decades, in many, many areas. But at the other end, there's a third framing, which is a security framing, this is about stability. It's about avoiding risks, some really serious risks, whether it's personal or collective security, or people often forget, the security services in countries are increasingly some of the strongest advocates for strong climate action. So the CIA has for a long time been a lobby at the heart of US government saying, look, the world of the 21st century is going to be complicated and dangerous enough without climate change thrown on top of it. The strategy is not, I want to optimize the size of my army to get an optimal level of invasion. No, it's like, no, you contain the challenge, you deal with it, you get enough mitigation to be safe. And as I said, I think that is at least at the highest conceptual level where people have landed. But I think it's worth thinking that not everybody is focusing on the whole global problem and trying to think what's the optimal strategy. Far, far, far. So I'm going to come back to that right at the end of this section, because I want to take you through a minor journey. And this is the one in lectures with students. I say, pay attention, because this bit matters, so the rest of this bit won't make sense. This is a really simple chart, and it basically says there is a relationship vertically between the resources that we put into an economy, all kinds of things, but in this case it's energy, or the ability of the atmosphere to absorb emissions, and then how much do I get out of it? That's maybe money, GDP, welfare, consumption, happiness, whatever you want to say. And the point is, there is a line there, a trade-off defined by technology. How good are we at translating resources into outputs, inputs into outputs, right? And the general assumption, usually in an economic textbook, that'd be drawn as a straight line. And it's called the technology frontier. I call it the best practice frontier because it's actually a bit more fuzzy when you look at technology. And you can move that frontier, and if you have suddenly decided you're in the wrong place, you may want to shift where you are to reduce emissions. It will come at a cost, partly because there's inertia in the system. So that, however, is embodying one of the structural fundamental assumptions of most microeconomics, which is that people and systems are inherently optimizing, or they strive to be. They will make the best use of the resources that they have. How many of you woke up this morning and thought, I'm going to optimize my energy use today? Right? Don't see many hands going up. I mean, we don't really do that. If you actually look at real people and real organizations, they're all over the place. And some of them are way short of this frontier of making anything like the best use of the technologies available. A few brave souls may actually have experimented in going beyond the best practice frontier and experimenting with low carbon lifestyles, that represented by a couple of dots beyond the frontier. In the book, that's what we call first domain behavior. Economics does have a term for it. Satisficing, horrible word, but basically means how come people seem to be satisfied with not optimizing? So it was a bit of a puzzle for us. That means the second domain is the jargon we use, the terminology for optimizing behavior. And the third thing then is that frontier moves over time. We get better at getting a degree of wealth or welfare out of the same inputs. The really interesting question is, how does that frontier move and in what directions, and can it lead to a transformation of systems? So that's what we call third domain economics, about the innovation and evolution of systems. And we go on to stress, there are rich theories under each of these three domains. The middle one, any economist will recognize. Many people think that's what economics is, but we have this whole domain where people are actually just expressing habits, myopia, individual preferences, risk aversion, inattention, 1,000,001 reasons why people don't make the best possible use of things available. And we've got now good theories of behavioral economics on that. And that implies there's a potential for improved efficiency, services, and lower bills. Nice. The third level is the transforming domain, where you are, and you're not talking about optimizing the trade-off given your technologies. You're talking about changing the technology set, changing the systems, structural and institutional changes. Typically, things you can't easily calculate, and they're more in the realm of strategy of where you're trying to go, what kind of infrastructure you build, what kind of developmental and social awareness do you have. And that implies the potential, that's where you get the potential for new technological systems. The point that I make in this book is not that these are fighting theories as to who is right. They are all right, but they apply at different scales of the systems. So by and large, a lot of the literature on satisficing behavior is looking at timescales of a few weeks to months in how people take decisions, or a couple of years. Markets, primarily a couple of years to a couple of decades time horizon. Transforming, the waves of technological change sweep the globe, take half a century at least. And the same in terms of the social scale. So all these three domains are always operating alongside each other, and that's vital to the underlying basis. But they have different theories of behavior, different theoretical foundations, different scales. In policy terms, and I've got an eye on the clock here, and this work is stimulated partly by the mantra that had come from economists for a long time, that the best thing to do is price carbon. And the answer is, well, if you are actually dealing with optimizing behavior and optimizing agents in social science terms, sure, markets and prices are frequently the most relevant thing you could do, the most efficient thing you could do. They may change behavior in the other domains as well. So if you double prices overnight or triple them, as happened in Europe recently, boy, do a lot of people start paying attention to energy use and may reduce energy use. Unfortunately, they're more likely to try and throw the government out of office first, because nobody likes paying 3 times as much for energy. What we've actually found is where efficiency policies have worked, they've done not with pricing primarily, but with standards or engagement programs. And similarly, to transform the system, of course, a higher carbon price can help, But fundamentally, you have to have public authorities involved in strategic investment. What kinds of systems are we trying to build for the future? What kinds of new technologies and infrastructure? So that is really the core, and it's almost become the iconic matrix of the book. And it says absolutely a role for carbon pricing, but if you really understand the nature of planetary economics, right from the question of big picture global decision making, right through to the individual behaviors of more than 7 billion people, you need to understand these wider frameworks for understanding decision. From that, you get the 3 pillars. And if I take you back to this chart in a form I showed you before, it's obvious. All that stuff that saved money on the far left was very real. And what's more, in some regions, and in Europe actually, a lot of effort has gone into shrinking that stuff on the left because we've become much more efficient in use of energy. There's still some areas that are a bit tricky where there are other areas. Carbon pricing has had a significant impact, particularly in the middle area. And so, I mean, I think to some extent we've been living through some of this. And I think my almost concluding slide of this section, I want to leave a few moments for questions to itself, is to bring you back to those 3 levels of risk perception. Part of the argument here as well is we can make more progress if we accept all of these diverse realities. I think, well, people who are basically, fairly myopic, etc., small attention, not really interested or motivated around climate change, they're still interested in saving money. And by and large, energy efficiency programs, when well implemented, have been very popular because they save people money as well as emissions. And at the opposite end, when you are in this realm of security framing of climate change, that's where you get the Paris goals from. That's where you get net zero from. And frankly, what we in Europe do to get net zero in 2050, or India does by 2070, is not going to hinge mainly upon whether or not we have a carbon price today, but it's going to be on the strategic investment in the technologies and systems that can get us there. So there's an alignment between the levels of risk perception and the kind of policy investments and the kind of actors you're trying to target to do the right thing. Finally, in this, just to say there is quite an important change here from the classical economic reasoning and its emphasis upon markets and pricing alone as the most efficient approach. It also implies that different problems are separable. Got a problem with sulfur, you tax sulfur. Got a problem with some health, you put a price on that. That's the way the market mindset works. You have an individual problem, you attach a price to it, the market sorts it out. In reality, that's not the way the world is. We are looking at systems and technologies which deliver multiple changes at once, in which markets will be one element of a policy package. The different problems are interconnected through the physical characteristics. And the strategy has to emphasize enhanced efficiency and transformation that potentially can generate economic benefits over time as well. So what that then leads you to is more or less that diagram I showed you before, but now subtly reframed in terms of the policy actions to emphasize also they form a dynamic view, right? The faster that technology frontier moves, and if you steer it in a low carbon direction, the more important it is that consumers remain engaged and can make the best use of the technologies and low carbon systems that you are developing. And of course, prices will help. But they're not the only lever at all. I'll skip them. And those different pillars of policy are interrelated in that journey. So if you have higher efficiency, it helps people manage energy bills better. They may be more able to consider the impact of a carbon price because they're assuming less energy. Carbon price would raise revenues that you could use to help fund R&D or electric vehicle infrastructure or whatever. The technology options in turn help you respond to the scarcity of carbon that you're trying to inform into the economic system, and the sense that carbon will get more expensive over time because of climate change should increase attention and help roll out the products and the finance to support diffusion to some of the points communities in particular. This is an interdisciplinary theory of economics, if I can put it that way. And to some extent, the whole book was trying to broaden our understanding to recognize too much of economics has just assumed the textbook optimizing behavior. Actually, the interesting stuff is largely beyond that when you're faced with a problem on this scale. But to do that, you need to have other disciplines involved, understanding the psychology and motivations, and also understanding the engineering and physical dimensions of what you can and cannot expect to do. For example, we're not going to discover, I don't think, energy which defies the laws of physics. So let's get real. And from that perspective, you can understand why solar and wind energy always were going to be an important part of solutions. Okay, so that was a canter through what actually is elements of a book of more than 550 pages. Obviously, there is more detail in there, but I know a lot of people do get quite depressed and spend their lives working on the science of climate change. And I just thought I would finish with one chart, and I will be saying more actually in a subsequent lecture, which was one sign of hope is there are many more countries that have now sustained emission reductions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. This is a chart snipped out of a paper we published last year, which found 24 countries sustained emission reductions, CO2 and all greenhouse gases, and even on a consumption basis. So this wasn't just offshoring industry elsewhere. And they all employed, most of them, has to be fair, were within the European Union, so they had the carbon pricing element fixed through the European emissions trading system. But all, in effect, employed three-pillar policies sustained since at least the mid-2000s. And in fact, some, particularly Scandinavia, started on that journey in 1990. And if you can pick out, I've not used a pointer here, but down towards the bottom right, you'll see, for example, Sweden there, and a couple of the Scandinavian countries have shown that it is possible to migrate from high carbon to increasingly low carbon systems, but it takes time and sustained effort. But hopefully that's a sign of hope. For those who are interested, want to hear more, I'm very lucky that thanks entirely to your good selves here, I should say, I realised I had the opportunity of turning this into a 3-lecture mini tour. So shortly I'll be giving a lecture on the innovation side of it, looking in much more detail at technological innovation systems over at NIAS 415. And then tomorrow evening, sort of indicating how some of these and related issues landed in the IPCC reports. And that one tomorrow in Delhi will be live streamed. So if people are keen, I'm not going to be giving the same lecture 3 times. On the contrary, I've taken the opportunity to hopefully span more ground in different areas with the other talks. Just at the bottom, I've said that finally I've realised I'm getting increasingly deluged with emails asking for this paper or that paper, this bit of information. So I finally entered the modern era and I've just set up a website where hopefully you can access research in a user-friendly way, a traditional academic website. So feel free to have a look and also tell me if it's hopeless. Okay, on that note, I will finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
if mitigating climate change, so aim for one policy, we should free market, that the free markets run right, let them run the course, or have more self-control, welfare-oriented Keynesian approach. So it's also
Yeah, and that's a good question. First, I should clarify, I think not many countries, but not much of the time, would have mitigation as their only or primary aim. It's nearly always going to be nested alongside other aims. I think for various reasons, including in part the legally binding constraints of the Kyoto Protocol, Europe went in arguably an unusual phase where mitigation really did become a very high policy priority, and a lot of policies were adopted specifically to try and cut emissions. But even those had to take account of social context and other pressures. And I think that your question is, I mean, it's a very important, it's quite a common question, and obviously it doesn't have a simple answer. And let me give examples why the answer can't be simple. It's an instinctive feeling, I think, amongst a lot of people that this is a big global public problem. I referred a lot to the role of public policy. Therefore, if governments control the energy and economic system, we'd be better off. Just look at the former Soviet Union, China, to decide if that's necessarily a good answer. And there's an ironic reason for that, which is you might think it's easier to control something if you own it. Actually, in some ways, it's easier for governments to control or at least to regulate something they don't own, because then it's somebody else losing the money if like pollution control. Actually, I did my PhD when we had a state-owned electricity system. I would not wish to have that as the prime means. But on the other hand, the idea that we solve it just by letting competition in everything and then maybe tweaking prices, that doesn't work either, because the private sector itself is myopic, driven by predominantly short-term profits. And many of the benefits in here are social benefits of cleaner systems or of innovation that you want adopted more widely. So you're never going to get the level of private incentive to do all of this. Final remark, one thing I think markets are very good at, if they're properly structured, is allowing new entrants to challenge the incumbent way of doing things. And I think however much government control, you want to preserve that freedom for new and better ideas and companies to enter.
So, you mentioned that there are different mindsets, and that there is this thing where if we approach more transformational mindset economics, then we can save a lot while being more innovative. What do you think is going to happen? Is it something that should happen on a personal scale? Like, do you think if a person themselves become more transformationally minded, would that help? Or how do you think that's going to happen right now if it doesn't happen personally?
That's a really interesting question. I think I'd give two kinds of responses. First, on just the purely behavioral dimension, there's been quite an extensive debate around this that I've seen over the last roughly 15 years or so, which started out with a lot of emphasis upon, never mind governments, if we can get environmental citizenship and people wanting to be clean and green in their consumer choices, that's how we'll solve the problem. And I think over the years, that debate has actually increasingly emphasized that, whatever individuals feel, if you like, strategically thinking individuals or environmentally strongly motivated people will, A, probably always be a minority of the population, and B, what they can do is constrained by the systems they're in. The physical systems, riding a bike down some of the roads here in Bangalore would be, I know people do it, but it may not be all that safe. And try driving on the motorways around London, cycling on the I mean, you know, your ability for low carbon transport is constrained by the infrastructure. And it's also constrained by social norms. So I think the IPCC this time did include, for the first time, a whole chapter on services and behavior. You know, what is it that people want ultimately? It's not energy, it's warmth, it's comfort, it's the ability to converse with friends and colleagues. But the ability of individuals to do that on their own is very contingent on whether the society also changes. Then the second part of your question, I'd say some things governments have always taken a strategic, whatever the citizens think. I mean, governments always understood it's part of their role to help invest in basic infrastructure, in basic education, in national defense. And this absolutely should be seen as part of the strategic responsibility of the government to help tackle climate change.
Can I have an attention? We have a question from an online participant. Can you hear me, Professor Michael?
I can, yeah, very well, thank you.
All right, we have a student from National Law School, Sarthak. Please go ahead with your question.
Good afternoon, Professor. It was a very interesting lecture. I just had a very simple question, sort of rudimentary, you'd say. So there are multivariant suggestions that you have made. However, I was just wondering if we could reconcile these suggestions with the way the UNFCCC operates. Like, even the most optimistic understanding of the Paris Agreement for me, it's a concurrence of principles that we want to seek net zero emissions, we want carbon neutrality. However, there is no concurrence of method. The very premise of the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, means that members are likely to prepare epistemologically variant proposals. There are differences in measurement of emissions, there are different estimations, different policies through which to implement sort of climate action. So in this situation then, is it not likely that some very large emitters can basically mess with the numbers and misrepresent what their actual contributions could be and what they're actually doing? And does that not affect how we go ahead with like mitigating climate change?
Yes. So there's, I think, a growing debate about the adequacy of the Paris Agreement in that sense. Let me make a couple of remarks. I mean, first, I spent 10 years working at the Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. By the end of that, I guess my bar got rather low to think that anything that you can get 200 countries to agree is a step forward. And the challenge of the Paris Agreement was defined by the previous era in which we had the Kyoto Protocol. It had set legally binding constraints on emissions from developed countries because the Framework Convention said developed countries had a responsibility to lead. And then there was, and it was actually to an extent designed by the United States to have flexibility and international emissions trading. But when there was an election in the US walked away. Most of the rest of the countries that had targets did stick with them. It's not well known, actually, surprisingly not well known. They all complied. There was 100% compliance with the Kyoto Protocol. But when it came to a next round, most of the rest of the developed countries said, well, without the US, and Canada's not part because the US is not part, what's the point? It's only regulating 15, 20%, if you're lucky, of global emissions. And there's just this huge explosion of emissions from the developing world. So the whole thing basically just collapsed at that point, or should we say it stopped in terms of any progression. The absolute insistence of the United States was, this is clearly a global problem. The only thing that makes any sense is a global agreement in which all countries are involved in a similar kind of way, even if quantitatively different. And many countries don't want to be told by the United Nations what to do or how much effort to make. So the Paris Agreement reflects that, and it was a classic choice of broad or deep. You were never going to have both, and it had to be broad. So inevitably, it's going to be a pretty shallow agreement in terms of the specificity of the commitments. They're not legally binding. Countries just bring forward what they think they can deliver. But the argument was that is going to be the nature of tackling climate change. It's going to have societal buy-in. going to have an element of countries accepting voluntarily responsibility for helping to make contributions. But yeah, I think if the thrust of your question is this good enough to actually achieve the objectives? Probably not, but it's impossible to see how we could have got anything stronger. And we may be wrong, because it is very interesting what is going on actually in sort of some of the innovation space and some of the globalization of initiatives in different regions. But it was, if you like, the Paris Agreement, a necessary gamble in moving to a weaker regime that everybody felt they could sign up to.
Thank you so much, Professor.
I need to step back.
They actually do cost negative, but the real situation is not happening. Those kinds of things are not being materialized. So you have to prepare this too. Times. Do you think that it is a failure of the market system? What needs to be cost negative benefits?
So, yeah, another good question. One of the challenges is so much of this literature just talks about the cost. And in the energy geeks here will know the term LCOE, the lifetime cost of energy. And the point is, well, that depends on your interest rate and your time horizon. I mean, most low carbon systems are more capital intensive, but cost very little to run, right? I mean, the wind is free, the sun is free, but a wind farm or a solar cell are not. Electric vehicles are also on the whole cheaper to run, but more expensive. So a lot of the question comes down to what's the cost of capital? What is the willingness of different entities to invest in something like that? And that's partly, does a country have deep capital markets? How short or long-sighted is the capital they can draw on? Governments are involved in infrastructure, not just because they're public goods, but because usually they're long-term payoff. So, you know, the basic problem is I didn't define what I meant by cost, and that was deliberate, because you could spend a whole lecture on what you actually mean in a world where mostly it's a combination of investment and returns. And tackling climate change, I suppose, in a way, I'm arguing, is one of the world's biggest investments, but also one of the world's biggest returns in terms of long-run value. But that doesn't mean it's going to easily happen. Doesn't mean the private sector is going to say, oh, I'm willing to invest a lot of money now and get some money in a few decades' time. Our economic system doesn't work that way. That, incidentally, is why we use that term strategic investment, and we actually in the book do define it more clearly as an investment made for the promise of longer term returns than would normally be funded in any private market. I exhausted everybody there. Thank you. That's been a real pleasure, and it is nice to travel again and to be, as I was saying before, to Bangalore for the first time in, I hate to admit it, 40 years. But I did come here as a kid. It's great to be back. Thank you.
you all.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.